first session is entitled How Far Have We Come? How Far Do We Still Have to Go? And we're really delighted that two of our founders, Professor Ross Cranston and Guy Dehn, are with us today, along with Oxfam whistleblower Helen Evans and Andy Noble, who heads up the NatWest Group, the whistleblowing team at the NatWest Group, along with our own Andrew Pepper-Parsons, who's the Director of Policy and Communications. And I'm going to hand over to Ross to chair the event. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Liz. I was there at the outset as a bit player. And as you saw Marlene Winfield on the screen. She was a major player. And Guy Dehn was a major player. But we're going to come to them in a moment. But I was privileged. It was one of the best things I did throughout my career was to be a trustee, and then I chaired the trust for a short while. And as I say, I'm very proud of that. So we've got this fantastic panel here. Immediately next to me is Helen Evans, who, as Liz said, was the Oxfam whistleblower. She was supposedly in charge of safeguarding without a staff, and she uncovered this scandal, and she did what whistleblowers are supposed to do. She went to the chief executive, she went to the trustees, she went to the Charity Commission, and it was a blank wall. And then eventually, to cut a long story short, the press, the Times, uncovered the story. And so Helen gave rise to this big story about the abuse that was occurring in Oxfam and more widely, not only abroad, but also in this country. She's now the CEO of the Rare Neurological Condition Charity, but she had a hard time as a result of what she did. So anyhow, we're going to come to Helen later on. Immediately next to her is Guy Dehn. You saw him on the screen already. He's still as handsome as that, I think. But Guy was brilliant. You wouldn't be here today without Guy. He was the first director. He drove it when I was a trustee, and then for a short while a chair. I didn't have to do anything. Guy did it all. He orchestrated things. He is largely responsible for the 1998 Act, although we can come back to that because there's an important political story behind that. Marlene, I don't think, is here yet. Oh, Marlene, you've just come in. We've seen you on the screen already. Marlene wrote the book, as we saw, Mind Your Own Business, and that sort of gave rise to the idea. But then Guy picked up the ball and ran with it and was absolutely brilliant. Next to him, and it's sort of, Guy was there 15 years, and Andrew Pepper-Parsons has been there for the next 15 years, so you cover the whole 30 years, the two of you. But Andrew is the Director of Policy and Comms at Protect, lobbying, campaigning, report writing, research. He knows it all. So we're obviously pleased to have him, and he's going to pick up the story after Guy has spoken. And then right at the end, we've got Andy Noble, head of Speak Up, whistleblowing at RBS since 2017. Before that, Andy had a very distinguished career as in banks, as in compliance, issues like money lending, which of course is the dark underbelly of banking, and I think you've also been a special constable for many years as well.
In the Met.
30 years, gosh, 30 years is really coming up today. Anyhow, this is the brilliant panel we've got. Now, I've been given a brief, and I have to stick to time, and I'm sure I will be told if I am overrunning. But this first session is really about the history and how things began and how things have changed over those 30 years. So I'm going to ask Guy, first of all, to say a little bit more about what it was like in the 1990s. You heard a bit of that on that video, but it was a totally different culture, as you saw from the short clip there. Guy, do you want to tell us about that culture and what the charity had to confront at that time?
Well, I think whistleblowing was viewed then as an act of sort of disloyalty and treachery. It was particularly viewed in the context of the public sector. So the government would view, say, Clive Ponting, or particularly in the official secrets field. So it's quite a sort of warped approach to what whistleblowing was. On the one hand, from the government as employers, the media viewed whistleblowers as occasional sources of good stories. I think so there's that aspect of whistleblowing. I think one of the important things Liz mentioned was when we started, we had one of the first sort of computers connected to the internet. And, the change the internet has brought in the way that people, the opportunities they have to communicate with other people has obviously been dramatic. Also, back in 30 years ago, it was pretty clear that the workplace was changing quite radically. So at that stage, and your parents and whatever, people would have tended to have a job for life. Marlene's book was called Minding Your Own Business for a particular reason. The culture was mind your own business and the organisation will cope with things themselves. Also, I think the other thing in the context of the workplace was it was quite hierarchical. So when we started, the view was, well, people can bring a complaint or they can bring a grievance. And obviously that meant that the worker had to prove their case, often through a formal procedure, and they would prove a case. The complaint or grievance was essentially where the worker had suffered something themselves and they were looking for some personal redress from it. So there wasn't really a culture or a mechanism that recognised a virtue of people being able to raise concern. So that was why we were called Public Concern at Work. I think those were probably the key structural changes then.
Let's come back to the legislation, because that's an interesting story about how that was achieved. But let me just go on now to Andrew. This is the first 15 years. And actually, Guy and Marlene, we got quite a lot of traction with the NHS very early on, despite what hasn't happened over that 30 years. But first 15 years, Guy's there. What's happened in the last 15 years in terms of change?
Yeah, I think whistleblowing is, when I reflect on when I first started the charity and when I got the job, I didn't know what that meant. So, I did the research and looked into it. It seemed really interesting. I think there's a much better understanding of whistleblowing. I think it's almost, if you think of any scandal, the kind of analysis is either it's come from a whistleblower, so it's come from staff, or the analysis in terms of thinking about what's happened is why haven't the whistleblowers come forward and what's maybe stopping that. And there is that kind of understanding as to what's gone wrong with the culture within the organisation, which is another point that's kind of feels like it's much sort of better understood and discussed. So I think those aspects have been the sort of the change. And I think organisations, there are a lot of organisations that kind of get that whistleblowing is that the best early warning system. The staff are the eyes and ears of the organisation, and Andy will speak to this because he works on that kind of forefront. But we're still in a spot, I think, where it's either not being done properly, so it's not being taken on board by senior leaders, it's not being understood by regulators, or there's whole swathes of our economy effectively that have nothing really in place. And we've seen that in YouGov survey results, that there's disparity between different sectors, and people don't really know if there's a whistleblowing policy or how to raise concerns. So I think and I think the other thing that I've also noticed in the media context is that media is holding, the powerful to account, and whistleblowing is really key to that kind of discussion. But I think one of the challenges is that it focuses on messages that have been missed, scandals that have happened, whistleblowers that are mistreated, and that can be a very negative message that kind of, there's a paradox where it kind of raises the profile of whistleblowing, but at the same time can make it look like quite a risky or dangerous thing to do. And that does happen, and that shouldn't happen. But there are plenty of whistleblowers that raise concerns and are listened to, and that's a testament to the work of this charity, really, that we have employers that are able and willing to kind of take that message on board.
Yeah. I'll turn to you, Andy. I mean, one of the things that Andrew has just touched on is how you, and I'm sort of spinning, I'm drawing out to some extent from what he said, but you get people who are talking the talk at the top of the organisation, some of these huge organisations, big organisations, but we still see the problem. Now, you're at one of the big banks, RBS. You're in charge of a whole section responsible for this. Why is it that we've seen problems we still see problems. We still see problems with the FCA, for example, in the financial sector. And as I said, in the NHS, what's the change in terms of since you've been doing it? Mm-hmm. And why is it that some organisations do it properly and others don't?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I feel like I'm the newcomer, by the way. So I started in 2016 for whistleblowing. So I'm very much, even though I thought I had a lot of experience, I clearly don't compared to this panel. But for me, so just talking about the financial services industry for a start, I mean, the thing that changed for us was when the regulations came in. So that came in when I started the role in 2016. So the FCA and PRA introduced new whistleblowing arrangements, requirements for firms. And that raised the game because you now have to have a non-executive director sits on the board that's responsible for overseeing and being concerned about how our whistleblower arrangements operate in the firm. And, that certainly provides some focus for the group. And it's allowed, obviously, me to do my job and to make sure that we can operate the framework as well as we possibly can. And I think that's been the key change for me. Some of the things that sort of in terms of other changes that I've seen, there's certainly much more focus now when I'm designing a framework and implementing it, thinking about the individual's concerns. So this isn't just about having a nice shiny framework that ticks a box, that you can say, here's our policy. Those days are gone now. You've got to be able to demonstrate that your arrangements are appropriate. They think about the people that are raising these concerns and they deal with them appropriately. And some of the things we're looking at just recently is things like the neurodiversity of the workforce. So therefore, how do you think about your comms? How do you think the way that you're, portraying your service to make sure that that is relevant for everybody that works in the workforce? And the other thing that I think has become clear is that if you don't create a culture where you deal with issues such as harassment, discrimination, inappropriate behaviour, that's going to stop people from speaking up. And I think that that's starting to be understood more. The final thing I guess I'll say on it is just in terms of the ability for us to sort of share best practice as well. So I attend a banking industry forum. I think some of the colleagues that attend that forum are here. And that's when quarterly the big banks and financial services organisations get together and talk about best practice of how we can make our frameworks better. So that is a huge development. And I think that there's some almost like peer pressure in a way that you don't want to be an outlier when you're at these forums, that you don't want to be seen to be, making progress with your arrangements. So I think that's all really, really good. I understand that's a financial services sector, so I'm very much, coming from that perspective. In terms of then, why do we still see problems? I think that there are still going to be times where, wrongdoing occurs. There's hundreds of thousands of people that work in the sector. And I think that depending on the organisation, it may still be difficult for people to speak up, even with all of these arrangements in place. So I think it's even more important for the work that, we're doing now to raise the profile, to make sure that, you walk the talk and don't just have your frameworks in place so you can tick a regulatory box.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Helen, I guess, I think it was 2014 you first raised the concern. The issue, public concern at work as it was and protect as it became had been around for quite a long time. The culture had been changing, but you go to, and this is Oxfam, you know, a huge charity, you go to Oxfam and you get nowhere. I mean, what's the explanation? And, you know, how we thought we were changing the culture in the 1990s, but come to 2014.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, to celebrate there has been progress and successes, and I think the points made by the panel are so important to hear. Not every story is like my story, but there's also a lot of discrepancy across sectors. So in the charity sector, my experience as a whistleblower was I went to the CEO, I went to the trustees, I went to the Charity Commission, I went to my MP, and nothing happened until another whistleblower went public in 2018. And then when I spoke out, the repercussions were such that I had to relocate. So what I think we need to see is more consistency of best practice across the sectors. So in the charity sector, you have a regulator, not an ombudsman. And what that means is they deal with only the highest level cases. They don't deal with the day-to-day. And then you see differences in terms of other sectors where it's been treated in a different way. So for me, I'd like to see much more consistency of regulation. I think also I would like to see the conversation reframed. So often whistleblowing is treated as an HR issue, and you're treated as an individual raising an HR concern. My experience was one of organisational abuse. There was the systemic sexual exploitation and abuse of beneficiaries, and there's the organisational abuse I experienced as someone trying to speak out and then facing those repercussions. And a £350 million organisation and their legal team, media team, and there was me and Protect. And I'm incredibly grateful for the support I received from Andrew, actually. It was Andrew was the person I was talking to on the helpline, which was amazing. You know, I would like to see a recognition of that organisational abuse and of whistleblowers as victims of that, which far exceeds the remit of an employment tribunal.
Did Oxfam ever apologise?
On TV? Yes. Oh, you know, we were a bit late to act on Helen's concerns. I mean, to be fair, it wasn't the Oxfam GB CEO at the time didn't. He never spoke with me, even when I was in there. That was the reason I whistleblew, is he cancelled a meeting with me 30 minutes before I was due to speak about a very serious matter. The Oxfam International Director did, actually. She came, and the new Oxfam director, who's now leaving, actually, Dehn did as well. So to their credit, I would say Oxfam GB has learnt, and there's still progress to be made. But, you know, this is why I'd say to people, do whistleblow, because whilst I suffered personally, there's been a legacy in the charity sector that has seen a shift, and safeguarding now is taken much more seriously, and Oxfam is not the place it was. And that's what makes it worthwhile.
And what you've used your experience in your current charity, and you were in a previous charity as well after Oxfam, you've used that to sort of mould the way these things are done?
Yeah, if I'm going to blow the whistle, I better run my own charity well. but no, it's, you know, it was a miserable time after I blew the whistle. And in my case, I was very fortunate to receive support in different ways that have meant that I've been able to get back on track, and I'm now CEO of a charity. But it's not the same for everybody. It definitely takes its toll.
Yeah. I mean, Andy, do you have any comments on that from the, you know, point of view of the organisation?
Yeah, I mean,
a huge
first of all,
organisation.
I should say that I don't have a lived experience as a whistleblower. You know, I obviously deal with a lot of people that raise concerns, but I, you know, complete respect for, you know, what you've had to do and the bravery you've shown. I think your point regarding sort of strong regulation across the sectors and consistency, I personally, that's my personal opinion, I think that's a good one. I think you see that where there is strong regulators and strong regulation, whilst it's not the silver bullet, it won't fix everything, but it certainly makes people sit up and think, particularly if they've got personal liability, if it doesn't get done properly. I think that's really important. And again, a personal view is that I always think that if you get to an employment tribunal stage, something has seriously gone wrong, something's failed. It's an opportunity for you to learn and understand, well, why are we here? You know, this shouldn't be that case. So, you know, I think that the points are all valid. If my recommendation, if I could make one, would be that all areas of industries have to have some degree of regulation requirements regarding whistleblowing frameworks. Now, you're not going to get one size fits all, clearly, but I think that it is important that you kind of have something that sets out expectations and that you'll be held to account.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I said we go back to the legislation, and Guy, if you could tell that story, because that was an interesting story. First of all, there was a Labour government, but it was also the minister, a name long forgotten, but Ian McCartney. Without that minister and without his commitment, I think, you tell the story from your point of view, and I'll tell it from mine.
First of all, when we, thank you for your nice words about me, but basically there was a brilliant team, and it wouldn't have happened without the brilliant team, and I probably wouldn't have been there without the brilliant team anyway. So there were lots of people involved in it, in and outside Parliament. When we started the organisation, we didn't know the answers. What we wanted to do was understand the problem better and think through what might be answered. So when we started in '93, our idea when people asked about legislation was that we might be in a position to run a campaign in like a decade. What actually happened was the Nolan Committee picked up our message incredibly quickly, and that was obviously with the Tory government of John Major. And following that, in the early 90s, we were approached by some backbench MPs, very independent-minded, cross-party backbench MPs, who said they wanted to do something. Well, Richard Shepherd, Tony Wright were the two main ones. And they said they would, you know, they wanted to do something on whistleblowing, and I said it was too, sorry, and I must emphasise Maurice Frankel from the Campaign for Freedom of Information, who was critically, at least as important as I was in all of that. And I said it was too early, and they said, well, we're going to do something anyway, and either we'll do it without you, or if you tell us what to do, we'll do it. And then, so I spoke to the trustees, and then we had to clear it with the Charity Commission because we weren't allowed to do it. So we had to sort of manoeuvre around that. And then we were very lucky. There was a 10-minute rule bill, which we then ran as a sort of green paper, and then got quite a lot of support from across the field for that. And then ran a private member's bill at the time of the Arms to Iraq inquiry. And
your luck to get someone who was prepared to take up your private member's bill.
Yeah, we were lucky in that. And, you know, the Arms to Iraq inquiry had a brilliant secret whistleblower, which meant, and then Tony Blair committed to do the legislation. We were incredibly lucky. What then happened was the election came in, Richard Shepherd came up in the private members ballot. We were able to run as a private members bill in sort of the first light of New Labour. There was a degree of, not necessarily distrust, but a sort of slight degree of suspicion between the government and the civil service, because there had been a Tory government for whatever it was, 13, 15 years. And we were able to sort of sneak through. But having said that, I mean, the detail of the legislation, no, I mean, the things that are wrong with it are my responsibility. But you have a limited capacity with a private members bill. We were probably very fortunate to have more influence over the content of it than normally. But
wouldn't have got it through.
Oh, sorry, without Ian McCartney.
Without the ministerial support.
Yeah, no. This is
you remember true. Before that, at NCC, we had worked on a private member's bill. We'd got it almost over the line, and then it was killed by the government.
No, okay.
Of the day.
Sorry. So what happened was when we did the private members bill in what was it, 96? So when the Arms to Iraq inquiry came up, Ian McCartney, who was a wonderful feet on the ground, earthy Scottish guy, and he was the only MP in the Labour Party that I was aware of who on his House of Commons paper said the socialist MP for Macclesfield. It was a word that wasn't commonly used in Labour then. But he had been the shadow minister for employment. One of the things that happened was the government had insisted this was all dealt with as an employment matter. We had not wanted it to be part of employment. We wanted it to be sort of general talk. They thought it would be easy to kill it by putting it in employment because business would say it was an intolerable burden. And we were able to move around that. But so Ian knew what the legislation was appointed by Blair as the Minister of State in what was then the DTI. And as I say, the culture between the incoming government and Whitehall was one of scepticism. And an example of that was at the first meeting we had with the officials about it, even though their Minister of State had basically committed to the bill, Tony Blair had committed to legislation on it. And we said, we went in there and thought, okay, we're on at least a level playing field, if not going downhill. And the officials just said, we said, this is what the government, and they said, the government don't know what it's doing until we've told them. And that was the culture at that point, and it made it a lot easier for us to ride the horse through Parliament afterwards.
But then very difficult to change after that. After 98, I remember I did a couple of debates, didn't I? I did something in Westminster Hall, a debate, trying to raise an issue. I can't remember what it was, but you told me what to say, Guy.
No, I mean, what happened afterwards?
We didn't get anywhere.
Whenever we did anything on the floor of the House, if we could do things using the democratic process, we won. And so there's a whole thing where the officials would try and move things into to be dealt with by regulation. So there was a lot of battle about it. Richard Shepherd always used to ask, why was it that the government would announce something when I'd just gone on holiday? And but anyway, no, we had a lot. There were a lot of very good MPs. We had a lot of good fun.
Yes, I think the point is the reason I'm obsessing about this is that politics is important.
Sure. And,
it's all very well to have ideas about what might change, but unless you get the political wind, it's difficult. Helen, sorry, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, just in terms of the legislation and in terms of your experience, where do you think the gaps are? What would be an improvement?
Oh, I think, as you say, that the law is incredibly important and critical. But then there's the putting that policy into practice. And I think for me, that's the key thing where it fell down for me. I shouldn't have been hounded out of my home and had to relocate. But that was, I invoked the legislation, but yet still my experience was one of experiencing that retribution. So I think there's a really key thing there around shifting that culture, and I think that's something Protect's did an amazing job at. Is rebranding the whistleblower as not the sort of the snitch, but as an individual who can bring about a lot of positive change and good for an organisation. It's healthy.
And what about this point about the tribunal? This is not the proper avenue. I mean, what was...
I feel that very strongly. So I chose not to go to tribunal because I thought if this hits the press in the future, I will lack credibility. If I was told I'd be pretty much guaranteed a settlement, watertight case, and I thought, so I'm not going to pursue that because I don't want them to use that argument against me, and to reduce this to a disgruntled employee versus the employer, because that's not what it was. This was something very much in the public interest. Something I'd love to see is advocates for whistleblowers So I've worked in supporting survivors of sexual violence, and within law you have independent sexual violence advocates and independent domestic violence advocates. And these are people who walk alongside the survivor who is bringing the abuse to the fore. Whistleblowers, in cases like mine, we have called out organisational abuse, we're experiencing that, and it is really lonely and hard to do that on your own. And I had some excellent advice from Andrew, but I was still the one in meetings with, you know, all these people who are fully briefed with their legal teams and media teams, and it was just me doing my research on the internet and argue my case, and I could have really have done with an independent advocate to stand alongside me. So I'd like to see that. I'd also like to see, you know, I could have sought recompense through a tribunal, got a settlement. I'd like to see whistleblowers treated as victims and entitled to compensation as a victim, because I think we need to really sort of shift the perceptions. But, you know, as was said here, I think it was amazing that the law got through, and it was the right thing to push it through at that time when you had that political interest. And we always look back in retrospect, think, oh, we should have changed this, we should have changed that. But that is, you know, it was marvellous, it did get through. But I can see opportunities now to build on that, and I hope there will be the political will for that.
So, Andrew, 15 years, after 15 years, where are the gaps, and what are the particular issues which you'd like to see a government take up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would want to just start to say, I think there is value in having decent employment law that protects people, whistleblowers, in that sphere, because I think the majority of the whistleblowing happens in the workplace, and we have a set of employment rights. And I think a lot of the problems come from the fact that the world of work has moved on from the Public Interest Disclosure Act as it currently is. I think I totally take on board Helen's point that there should be, I would probably see it, characterise it more as additional support, and to kind of understand much more the kind of barriers and the things that whistleblowers face, so add on top of that. So I'm going to probably keep my remarks quite about the kind of the law as it stands. And I think one of the key things is we talk about scope, which is kind of a very techie word, but it's just to make sure that all the workers that are raising concerns are covered by the Public Interest Disclosure Act. And there are gaps there, and I think there's a better understanding that it's not just a traditional contract of employment that kind of needs that protection. We also need to think about non-executive directors, volunteers, that kind of thing. So people that are raising concerns but don't have that traditional contract of employment, because they still suffer victimisation, and we see that every day. I think the second point, which I think is a much bigger topic, but it is access to justice. There is research showing that most whistleblowers, well, a lot of whistleblowers, are litigants in person, and they're often facing an organisation that is lawyered up. So there's a real disparity of kind of arms, and there's ways of making the employment tribunal process a lot less hostile for the whistleblower through extension of time limits, re-examining things like legal aid, and there's a legal reform panel that will get into much more detail around these things and other things. And the third thing I want to say, which I think really is kind of the key issue, is that the Public Interest Disclosure Act is silent on what is expected from an employer. So it is, that guy, when I started working, explained the Public Interest Disclosure Act as the law of assault. It doesn't stop the fight from happening. It steps in afterwards and kind of punishes people post that. And I think actually the Public Interest Disclosure Act can be much more proactive. I think there's a much better understanding of what, as Andy said, it's not just about having a whistleblowing policy, but having the kind of support mechanism around that. And we can expect organisations to have those things in place. And I think there's more understanding about how you can tailor that to larger organisations, smaller organisations as well. So you have you don't have a one size fits all, but you have some kind of set principles. And I think those are the areas where we can improve the current law at the moment and kind of expect much more in terms of standards. But I do absolutely take the point as well that I just want to say that we can't design compliance. We have to get to a point where whistleblowing is not seen as, it's seen as a benefit from organisations. I don't think every employer by any means understands the idea that your members of staff who are blowing the whistle are your most loyal. And that's still a key shift that needs to happen. I think whilst acknowledging that whistleblowers are often challenging powerful people, challenging decision processes, I still think we're quite a hierarchical society in this country, and that we're not necessarily open as leaders to hearing those things that are coming in and doing something about it, or seeing it as the responsibility to kind of communicate what's happening there. And that can't be created through a law. It has to be created through a cultural shift.
In terms of the law, though, in terms of the specifics that you've just identified, have you got your clauses drafted?
Yeah, there's a draft bill. I don't want to go into too much detail because, well, it's one, I've got a pitch that I give to officials, but also Liz is going to talk about it in the legal reform panel. And yeah, I don't want to kind of trample too much. But there's a draft bill. There is a draft bill on our website that is very detailed. It's well worth looking at. Sybil will be very happy that I'm pointing this out because it's her baby. But yeah, it's drafted by Liz actually. So we have got the clauses that we send round, and there's plenty of briefings. So.
Okay, well, look, we've got 10 minutes for discussion. I don't know whether, Marlene, you came in. You were on the screen for quite a long time. Tell us about the history. But I don't know whether you've got any thoughts. You haven't seen what's on the screen, but one of the things you did make, one of the points you did make is we were very lucky to get that Roundtree grant. Which, you know, provided a very substantial financial foundation. Then, of course, Guy did an awful lot of training, and we raised money that way. But financially, we were pretty well off. But Marley, I'm sort of
big success. We were one of the first things they funded ever that became self-financing. And so we were the flavor of the month from Roundtree for a long time. But just going back to the discussion, one of the things that really surprised me in my naivete when I wrote Minding Your Own Business was that the trade unions and the regulators did nothing to help the employees. And of course, this was before the legislation, so there wasn't any help at all. But even when people went to the regulators, in the case of a welder on an oil rig, in the case of an insurance and an accountant in an insurance company, and suffered for it, the regulator did nothing, even to support them in their case when they were being sued for defamation by the company for going to the regulator. And the regulator made no effort to help them. And the trade unions, of course, were in a very difficult position because it might have been employee against employee. But I think the role of the trade unions and the role of the regulators really needs to be re-examined, along with all these other things for the future. And the one other thing, going back to something that Andy said about what happens once you have a policy. I worked in the NHS and the Department of Health, my last jobs. Whistleblowers have an impossible situation there, as we saw in the Letby case, because on the one hand, they have a duty to blow the whistle for safety reasons, and on the other hand, in their same employment contract, they must not bring the NHS into disrepute. And these things are completely counter to one another. And I wonder if what we don't need is some sort of a standardized register. You talked about a non-exec director who was in charge of whistleblowing. If we don't need some sort of standardized register in the NHS, in organizations, in the way that you have to have risk registers in order to satisfy regulators, you have a whistleblowing register where people raise concerns, the concerns have to be noted down, and then like a risk register, there has to be a response to what you've done in relation to that, and that is a register that is there for the regulator to see and other people. And I think in the NHS, with electronic health records and things, I think, having an electronic register there where you have to show what you've done might be a way to legitimize whistleblowing and make clear where that balance is between bringing an organization into disrepute and actually saving it from going into disrepute.
Yeah. Thanks, Marlene. I'm sure we'll come back to that later on today. Just in terms of the history, though, I was chatting with Anna, because Anna, you were on the screen as well, and you were there. Any comments on changes since when we began?
Come in. Yeah, I'm so delighted to
Just
listen.
explain who you are.
Oh, sorry. My name's Anna Myers. I was Deputy Director at Public Concern at Work with Guy Dehn, my mentor there, and then moved on and started the Whistleblowing International Network, which is an attempt to allow the organizations that support whistleblowers to talk to each other. Because just as whistleblowers are so isolated, the organizations that support them are often isolated within their jurisdictions. And there's very hard-won lessons learned on the ground and that they need to share with each other. So just as you were talking, Andy, about the bankers getting together, we're trying to get the whistleblower protection community together to discuss what we're learning and what the changes are and what's coming, because we see corruption obviously going global. Helen's case, there were issues around abuse happening outside of the UK. So it's really important we work together. I was going to ask Guy in particular, I thought you mentioned at some point along the way, it sat with employment law, it goes to tribunals. What's wrong with that? Are the tribunals equipped enough to hear these cases? Do you think that the general tribunals is where these cases should go? Certainly there's been talk about trying to educate judges, because judges around the world themselves are often put in difficult positions, and when they start to understand whistleblowing as a public interest issue in which someone is squeezed, they start to perhaps respond differently. So I thought I'd ask Guy if there was something like that you would like, that looking back, you sort of think would have helped or could help.
Well, not only Guy, the rest of the panel as well. But Guy, you start. You were her mentor.
It was something that was discussed very early on, and there were two reasons. One, a process one. The process one was we always wanted the thing to be run as a private member's bill and not to be run, in a sense, from the government machine. And perfectly properly, the government controls the purse strings. And so there's very little capacity within a private member's bill process to spend money, or at least you can't spend money without the government's consent. So setting up a new tribunal would actually have been problematic on that level. But I had, I'm not sure I was exactly right, but one of the reasons is that another reason, a substantive reason why I was unsure, and I'm not persuaded I was entirely wrong, is that we have a lot of regulators. To me, whistleblowing is very tightly, closely connected to accountability. It's essentially, it's the way information or notice of a possible wrongdoing is communicated as to whether it's communicated up a line, who it's communicated to, and what they do. And that is to me, the most effective way of a deterrent to things to stop going wrong, and where they are going wrong, for them to be sorted early with the minimum damage. So there is an importance to the internal accountability of the whistleblowing within an organisation. So obviously, like what Andy was talking about, and lots of people here.
I'm going to cut you short.
With regulators,
we have to finish.
It's also important. So there are lots of different regulators. Yeah. And the question is, do you duplicate the regulator with a tribunal that's investigating what the regulator or the employer's response is?
In those days, of course, I couldn't tell him what to do. He told me what to do, but I can tell him what to do. But just quickly, in terms of what Marlene and Anna have said, Andy, have you got any thoughts? And then Andrew, and then finally Helen.
Yeah, so I mean, interesting conversation, just briefly. So I'm kind of coming at it from a different angle, really, in a way, a bit like what you said, is that for my job, I don't want it getting anywhere near the place where we're talking about tribunals, legislation, etc. And a lot of things that I deal with don't even meet the bar of a protected disclosure. So for me, I think it's the accountability needs to be on the firms to put in place appropriate arrangements. And why wouldn't you? Why would I not want to hear from my employees about things that isn't right and wait to hear about it in the press, in a tribunal, or somewhere that I can't actually do anything about it? It's too late. So for me, I try to come at it from a different way, is that make sure you've got appropriate processes in place, first of all, and actually, shouldn't need to go. Now, I know that's in perfect world, but that's how I look at this.
Yeah, I think I take Guy's point, actually, that I think regulators is quite a broad term for lots of organisations with different powers and different roles and responsibilities. And that is actually a real challenge in the whistleblowing space, because I don't think regulators are really thinking about their role always in terms of shaping or expecting or requiring, or what powers they have to kind of push that kind of, so that organisations like Andy's organisations have the kind of rules in place, they know what they're doing, but also it kind of creates the framework where people like Andy are the allies who can push those things forward. And I think that's a real challenge because the tribunal is really only looking at the breakdown of the employment relationship, that kind of compensation picture, and that's very different from that, either how the whistleblowing arrangements work in practice, or how the public interest concern itself that a whistleblower is trying to raise is being dealt with. And that's the real challenge, because I don't know, I'm actually not that convinced that there is a super regulator or a tribunal can look at all of those things at once.
Yes,
I think that's a real challenge. I do think there's probably an argument to say you can have a central body that sets standards. And I think sounds a little less glamorous, but I think that might be a bit more realistic.
Mm. Helen, you've got 1 minute and 3 seconds.
I think bottom line, in my case, the employment tribunal is insufficient. But I think, the question raised there by Guy, the Charity Commission is a regulator, not an ombudsman. And I wonder if the Charity Commission had more powers, would I see this differently? So I think it's a good question. I'll end there.
OK, well, look, thanks very much. Fantastic panel. Good start.